Hello, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to Commonwealth's past, present, and future. The old saying is, there's no place like home. And it's true, we all love home. Go off on a trip, when you start heading back, you just can't wait to get back home. Maybe you have a favorite chair you want to sit in. Maybe you just want to climb back into your own bed. Or perhaps when you go take a shower, there's nothing like that particular shower that will go ahead and make everything go perfectly fine. We all know that kind of house. But you know, the reality is that the homes we live in today were certainly not the way it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300, even 1,000 years ago. It was all completely different. And so in order to understand more about the things we take for granted, which is the comforts of home, we have today's show and our guest, Mr. Dennis Vanderlask, who is a member of the Petroleum County Historical Commission. And so, Dennis, thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure.
And yeah, the comforts of home. This is a rather interesting topic. I've never met anyone that's actually researched this before. And so I guess the really first question is, what got you interested in this?
Well, this started about 10 years ago. I was serving as a volunteer over at the Ripon Lodge Historic Site in the Woodbridge area of Prince William County. And at the time, they were preparing the building prior to its opening to the public. Now, Ripon Lodge was built in phases. The first part of the house is built, we think, in the mid-1740s. There was an add-on in the early 1800s and another add-on in the early 1900s. And I was asked to take a look at what was going on in residential architecture at the time in order to better interpret what was happening in the architecture of Ripon Lodge. So this was a period spanning from colonial architecture to something called colonial revival in the early 20th century. And something hit me square between the eyes, and that was if you lived in a fancy, high-style house in the mid-1700s, you were likely to be a lot less comfortable in your creature comforts than somebody in a more modest, very pedestrian small bungalow in the early 20th century. And as I looked into that a little more, I found out that comfort actually evolved with the architecture of the houses, the degree of comfort. Now, when I talk about comfort, I'm talking about what we call creature comforts or sensory comforts. It's comfort to the point as, do you want to be warm when it's cold outside? Do you want to be dry when it's wet outside? Do you want to have light? And there are other types of comfort in history. There's political comfort. You don't want to aid and give comfort to the enemy. There's even medical type comfort we have in palliative care these days. So comfort actually has a real rich history to it.
And it seems like the word comfort is also a rather vague term instead of one that you would take for granted of saying, well, I'm comfortable because you feel good. It's more of a, there's a lot more to it that meets the eye.
But again, in this instance, I'm looking primarily at the sensory comfort. Now, there are lots of mental comforts, too, that have much more subtle characteristics to them. But again, sensory comfort here.
All right, now, as we look at sensory comfort then, you know, the things that you have around you, what would you say is the most notable, I guess, evolution that seems to be consistent in this sensory comfort?
Well, I think the interesting thing that in the evolution is that there's an interplay between certain comforts. As you see, the ability to, say, cook our food to a more palatable taste, the heat that's required to do that also some of the techniques can be used to heat your house too. So they work together. One of the things that is very obvious to me is that today, when we think of comfort, there are certain comforts a couple of hundred years ago that we would not even think of today. I'd like to give an example of acoustical comfort. If you had a farmstead house, say in the mid-1700s, it would normally be a small working house. You would probably have a garret or an attic area where you might do a lot of the industry of a farmstead. This would include weaving, spinning, and you'd have spinning wheels and weaving looms set up, likely in the garret. These things are made of wood. They make a lot of noise when they operate. That noise is transmitted through the wood floor, through the joist, into the living area of the house. So if you're in that living area of the house during the day, you are subject to a din of noise that goes on. And we don't really realize that when we visit historic houses these days. All the historic houses are nice and quiet, but there are levels of comfort that we're not used to. And these people had to put up with it.
Now, we think about these like the subtlety things, little devils in the detail situation. So, you mentioned cooking, and let's face it, we all love food. I know when I cook in the kitchen, it's great, and of course, we've had a lot of cold winters lately, and my wife says, run the dishwasher, run the laundry, it'll warm the pipes up with the water going. This would be a sensory comfort then, in that respect, for modern day. What would somebody from the 1700s or 1800s have to deal with? Like, for instance, with like the kitchens, you're saying it heats the house. I mean, in what way are you looking at?
Well, the original kitchens were not very desirable places. Today, usually the kitchen is the focus of a house. You had to deal with a lot of smells. You had to deal with a lot of dirt and disorganization. In most cases, a lot of times, either the servants or in the South, the slaves were, basically relegated to kitchens because they were really undesirable. Now, in New England houses, your kitchen was probably in the house, and you'd be able to capitalize on that heat. In the South, you see more often than not individual buildings next to your house as an outbuilding for a kitchen house per se. But what's very interesting about the kitchen is that it was not really managed by anybody critically in the house. Around 1860s, we meet a woman by the name of Catherine Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister. And Catherine Beecher was a big advocate for women taking a greater role in things in society. And up to that point, women didn't really run a household. She encouraged women to get out there and organize and manage the house, take those duties away from your husband, and also go out and do other things too. And she published a book called The American Woman's Home. I think it was published by 1868. And in that book, she actually makes suggestions to women on how to better organize a kitchen. She brings things like bins for your flour, bins for your corn. She even has sliding doors. Make the kitchen a cleaner place and eliminate some of the odors that you have to deal with when you're dealing with meats and raw vegetables. Now, so we start to see a step in the evolution to the modern kitchen from disorganization to organization. In the late 1800s, Louis Pasteur, the germ theory becomes popular. People realize how diseases spread. And a lot of hospitals start to have very organized white cabinetry and glass front cabinetry in the hospitals. The people who looked at kitchens say, we really need to take and transpose that stuff into our kitchens and make our kitchens more sanitary. In the process, we start to have sources of energy, and we find that we can now direct gas into a kitchen and have a water heater, so we can now have hot water in our kitchen to make it more sanitary and more comfortable in the process. So you can see where I'm going. Mm-hmm. Then we get into the 20th century, and we have the advances in electricity being made available, and many kitchen appliances are based on heating, which electric is really well suited for, particularly portable electrics. Then we see, at this point, less drudgery on the part of the American female who is charged with running the house and running the kitchen. And what's ironic about this, by the time we hit the 1950s, it kind of backfires on her, and she becomes a slave to the kitchen. This is pre-women's movement. Mm-hmm. So we see this transition sociologically, but the kitchen in the process is a much more comfortable, less dirty, much more safe place to work in the process.
Now, one of the things that I did notice that you mentioned a lot of is sanitation, smells, you're changing this around. And one thing that I do remember even from my history classes from way back in is that if someone from today were to travel back in time, one of the first things they're going to notice is the smell. And so, since we're talking about sensory comforts, smell is probably one of the most powerful senses we have in the human body. Exactly why is it the world doesn't stink today compared to then?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. It's sanitation. And sanitation, of course, takes small steps in the process. If you go back to the time of Queen Elizabeth I, she had one of the first what we call a commode. And the actual name for that device is called a dual siphonic pan. And it has to do with U-shaped plumbing, being able to, if you move water out of it, it forms a vacuum and it can suck other water fluids into the pipe. The problem with water-based sanitation commodes is you have to have a source of water, a constant, reliable source of water, and also a place to remove the waste in a, again, sanitary, clean fashion. Now, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, those things didn't exist, so she had some special arrangements in the palace. But as we get into American history, the popular way of working sanitation is through the privy, the individual house that usually has a hole dug in it. And there was some work done in the Eastern Virginia area about 10 years ago, some archaeological work, where they actually found some really fancy privies. They had a brick privy with actually a fireplace in it, and it can accommodate a number of people in a hierarchy of seating. So privies weren't always the backwoods type of structures that we associate them with. Now, there were attempts, because if you think about comfort, going out to a privy in the middle of a cold winter night is not a comfortable proposition. So how do you get this in the house and control the odors and smells? There were chamber pots that people used beneath their beds, and again, that wasn't a pleasant arrangement either. But there were some attempts to actually mimic what we probably call today a litter box, when you have a cat litter box. It was actually a small commode with sand, and the sand would absorb odors, and you'd have to, of course, empty the sand out. They got to the point where in multi-story houses, there was a concept actually proposed where you have a lift where you could lift sand up a couple of stories, have a reservoir of sand, a couple of commodes where you pull the cord, sand would come down, fill the commode, and move the waste to a receptacle at the basement of the house, which was next to the ashes that were emptied from the furnace. So when the ash man came to remove the ashes every week, he removed the waste. That never got a lot of traction. That idea wasn't really practical. Until modern plumbing, modern water systems became available, that's when you had your really ground-shattering change in sanitation. And the man who actually created that change was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Crapper in England. And Crapper actually took the idea that they used with Queen Elizabeth I. He was able to mate it to, he ran a plumbing supply business. He was able to mate it with modern plumbing and with waste disposal, and created the commodes under the brand name Crapper, which still exists today.
It's also used in colloquial terms as a result.
Right.
So.
Well, it's very interesting. The family was a well-regarded family, and a lot of people began to change their names.
I wonder why.
There's not too many of them in the phone book any longer over there. But he actually made the change, and the company is a very well-respected company today. They are very high-quality equipment, but he was the man who had the vision to resurrect an old idea and retrofit it into modern times, then modern times.
Now, one of the things, certainly the idea of you don't want to find yourself in a bad position of walking into waste. I mean, I've done that myself. I have a cat that did that one time, and it's ugh. Yeah. And so, today, you fumble around, you look for the light switch, and God help you if the bulb goes out. And you brought with you today an artifact which kind of goes into this next thing of stumbling around in the dark, and that is the ye olde light. And so you have this little gas light here on the table, and so I've seen the biblical version of it, clay. Kind of designed like that. You put your oil in there, you light the other end, and hope it doesn't blow you up. How does this one work exactly? Okay, well, this, oil lamps go back to, millennia. They've been around a long time, and the oils were basically oils derived from plants and some animals like fish. Oil has always been an expensive commodity, and this kind of reflects the expense of the commodity.
In the United States, the early oil lamps, were basically utilizing, again, animal materials and plant materials. People began in the 1800s to capitalize on the oil that's available in whales. There was a whale called the right whale, a species of whale called the white whale, that could yield about 65 barrels of oil in there. But whale oil was still expensive. Eventually, you had sperm whales, and they had a higher quality but less amount of oil in the whale. But they also had something called spermaceti, which we'll get into in a minute. But if you had a very, very expensive commodity, you want to be able to meter out that commodity. And this is a design. It's actually a Scotch design, which is the precursor of something called a Betty lamp. It dates from the mid-1700s. And what it does is it has a little extra reservoir which you can tilt and control the flow of oil and meter it very carefully into a spot where you actually light the oil. You can actually put a little wick in there too. And the trick is it meters the oil and it conserves the oil as the lamp burns. Now, this did not give out a lot of light. So it is a very, very dim light, but it's better than nothing in the middle of the dark.
Right.
It has a little reflector up here, which reflects it down.
Now, for something like this, how long would, effectively the earliest kind of gas lamp, or at least it's an oil lamp, how long did this last as a method of getting light into a house? Well,
there's a transition. You actually have candles too, and candles were probably more widely used than oil lamps, at least at a certain point in time in the 1800s. But candles are expensive. Very early candles were made out of something called tallow, which was a kind of a fat rendered from animals. It smelled, it sputtered, but if you didn't have a lot of money, that's how you basically got your light in the house. If you really didn't have a lot of money, people would actually burn pine knots from pine trees. The actual knot would actually have enough sap in it to burn, and rosin. What happened, though, the transition to these other lighting materials happened with, of course, rail oil, and then the discovery of petroleum. With the discovery of petroleum, we now had some other substances such as kerosene, which you could put in a reservoir. It was a little cheaper than whale oil, but it was still did not provide a very bright light. There was a study I read a number of years ago that stated that for the amount of kerosene, the cost to buy an amount of kerosene to provide about 5,000 candle power of light, that same amount of cost, if used with electricity, would provide about 4.4 million candle power of light. So you still had a very dim environment you had to put up with. Gradually, people began to use, in Virginia, they had candles made out of bayberry, which was a plant that kind of grows near the shore and has berries. And if you boil the berries down, it forms like a wax. And this allowed you to have a better smelling light in your candle source. Spermaceti from the sperm whale could be processed into a wax, and you had spermaceti candles. Probably this would be like mid-1800s or so. Then eventually, with the petroleum industry, you had paraffin, and candles became very cheap at that point in time. It's interesting to note that the early Anglican churches in Virginia one of the reasons they did not use stained glass was because stained glass does not let a lot of light into the building, and you have to use candles and spend money on lighting the building. Where if you had non-stained glass, it's a lot easier to keep your sacristy lit.
Yeah, interesting. Now, when we look at, obviously candles and oil gets transitioned out to electricity. Was electricity just seen as a better sensory comfort, or was there a bit of hesitation in getting involved with that?
Well, there's two things that happen. You had gas lighting that occurs before electricity, and initially gas lighting came from the processing of coal into coke, and then you discovered natural gas. But what gas lighting did was you could have the source of the energy on demand. Unlike candles or oil, where you had to buy a certain quantity of it to store it in your house, with gas lighting, you could now pump into, you didn't have to store anything in your house. You could just pump into a utility, and they would supply it to you as you needed it. People like that idea. And electricity was the next step in that supply and demand type of energy. Again, gas was kind of dim. Gas, there were some safety issues with too, as you can well imagine. Even kerosene, I think there were like, in one year there were recorded 5,000 deaths from kerosene lamps. So it was a dangerous process. Now, of course, when Thomas Edison started to demonstrate electric lights, and which was not a real easy thing to do, there were a number of people who actually invented it before him. He just basically improved upon it and made it practical. We then had the ultimate in demand, where you didn't have to deal with gas. You had like 186,000 miles a second, the speed of light. The energy was provided to your house, and this was quite convenient.
And so when we think about these creature comforts, we do talk about the things that are great, but let's be fair. I mean, there are some things that are probably just very uncomfortable to consider as well. What are some of the most common discomforts which maybe we take for granted even today that existed back then but are still maybe even prevalent now that we don't think about?
Well, I think if you look at the discomforts in the past, I like to use the kitchen as an example. If we go, let's say you're preparing a chicken. You go to the supermarket today and you have cut up chickens, and they're refrigerated, they're clean, they are pre-wrapped. You bring them home, there's no smell to them because they're still clean, and you either bake them and do whatever you want to do with the chicken in your modern house. Now, think back a couple hundred years ago. You had to go catch the chicken, first of all. Then you had to kill it, which was not a pleasant topic. The chicken was room temperature, actually warmer than room temperature. It was, since it's a warm-blooded animal, and then you have to deal with a lot of smells. You have to deal with these inside your kitchen room or kitchen house, and this is where you're dealing with, let's call it an unsanitary situation, plus just wonderful malodorous situations that are, again, usually relegated to the servant class to put up with.
Mm-hmm. And so, when we look at all these different, discomforts and comforts, what would you say is probably the most important lesson to learn from all this? Don't take everything for granted, or there's always room for improvement. What do you think is the most important thing to take away from it all?
Well, I'll tell you that one of the most critical things that I found when I looked at the process of how these different comforts came online, so to speak. If you look for a period of time between about, maybe mid-1800s to around 1930 or so, you see an acceleration of comforts, particularly with electricity. And there was a very interesting study done of the original Eisenhower house where Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, grew up. And there was a period, I think, between about 1920 and about 1945 or so in this Eisenhower household, where there were a whole number of technologies introduced. Since then, after then, the number of comforts, say, in a kitchen or in the rest of the house have somewhat, the acceleration process has decreased. If you look at a kitchen in the last 50 years, probably the only real significant change has been the introduction of a microwave oven. Everything in a kitchen today, except the microwave oven, is probably the same as my mother's kitchen in the 1950s growing up in Long Island. So there's these fits and starts, these accelerations of advances in comfort, and then they taper off. They taper off to a plateau for a while. And then there is some other area of comfort that will then enter in.
Yeah, so depending on where it is, it just kind of keeps going to different, I guess, the needs of society or the needs of a person?
Well, both, when you look at it. Sometimes you have to look at the question of what is your house? What does a house mean to you philosophically? Some people, a house is a show place, and they're going to want to have the latest comforts, the latest advances in their house to be able to kind of show it off. Some people are a little bit more utilitarian and just want to use their house as a place to live and focus something else in their life as their primary mode for living. So it depends on the person as to how they strive to incorporate comfort into their houses.
Fascinating. Well, Dennis, thank you for coming on to the show. It's been very interesting just to think about, where we've been, and thank God we're here today, based off of everything that you told us. But as a small little token of our thanks, we'd like to go ahead and give you a copy of our book, Historic Cemeteries of Northern Virginia.
Thank you.
Granted, it's on the tail end of the comfort sphere, but certainly maybe an area of interest to go ahead and see how we want to make sure we get one last good rest, so to speak, before all is
Or rest in peace, where peace is a comfort.
One hopes it can be in the grand scheme of things. And certainly the idea of getting to have a very comfortable existence in our lives today is something that is near and dear to every single one of our hearts. To learn more about the topic of comfort in our home and how it's evolved, you can go ahead and check out our website, www.timetravel21.com, or email us at timetravel21@yahoo.com. This has been Virginia Time Travel, your portal to Commonwealth's past, present, and future, reminding you that as you go ahead and lean back in your chair and maybe put up your feet on the ottoman, just remember, this simple action has a history all of its own. Might not seem very important to you, but the reality is, one man's comfort is all that really matters. Thanks for watching.